Hello, everyone, and good evening. Wish you all a very happy International Archives Day. And good morning to you, Erin. For this year's masterclass titled Future Legacy Activating Institutional Memory for Innovation, Trust, and Growth, we have with us Erin Narloch, all the way from the USA. Erin is Senior Director for Business Insights and Performance at History Factory USA. We're eager to begin this masterclass, but before that, a few words by Dr. Firoza J. Godrej, Chairperson of the Godrej Archives Council. Over to you, Dr. Firoza.
Thank you, Shweta. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, Erin, halfway around the world in Chicago. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the annual masterclass hosted by Godrej Enterprises Archives, as Shweta said, on the occasion of International Archives Week. Each year, archives and heritage institutions across the world come together during this week to celebrate the enduring value, record keeping, memory, and the preservation of our collective past. While archives have traditionally been viewed as repositories of history, today they are increasingly being recognized as dynamic resources that help institutions understand who they are, where they have come from, and where they are headed in the future. At Godrej Archives, we believe that archives are not merely custodians of memory, they are catalysts for insight, innovation, and continuity. Through records, as I said, photographs, importantly, in our case, objects, oral histories, which we started documenting, and business documents, we seek not only to preserve a 129-year legacy of the Godrej Enterprises Group, but also to make that legacy accessible, relevant, and meaningful for everyone in the contemporary world, contemporary audiences. Through these annual masterclass series, we aim to foster conversations that expand our understanding of what archives can do, not only for historians and researchers, but for organizations, in our case, brands, and the communities seeking to build meaningful futures grounded in authentic legacies. I think it is fortuitous, therefore, and especially fitting that this year's masterclass explores the theme, as Shweta said, future legacy, activating institutional memory for innovation, trust, and growth. Erin, we're really delighted to welcome you to lead us through this conversation. Erin Narloch is Senior Director, Business Insights and Performance at the History Factory in the USA. And as our speaker, she will guide us through this session. Erin is widely recognized as a leading voice in the field of strategic heritage. And over the course of her career, she has championed innovative ways of transforming organizational history into a powerful business asset. Thank you once again, Erin, honoring us with your presence today. And I hope that everyone enjoys and learns immensely, as I will, from this session. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Firoza Godrej, for your address. I'd like to now call upon Vrunda Pathare, Head of the Godrej Archives, to introduce our speaker for the day.
Yes, first of all, welcome everyone and wish you all happy International Archives Day. And it is my immense pleasure to introduce you, Erin. I remember meeting Erin through the International Council of Archives section of Business Archives. And one of my most memorable interaction with her was at the 2019 ICSBA conference in San Francisco, where we were fellow panelists in a session titled Demonstrating the Relevance And I have to admit that presenting, after Erin was not easy. Her presentation on the Reebok archive was so engaging and filled with fascinating stories that she had the audience completely captivated. That's what I remember. And as I waited for my turn, I found myself enjoying her presentation as much as everyone else and quietly worrying about how I was going to follow it. But it is my pleasure that I heard you at that conference, and I must admit that she has a remarkable ability to uncover brand stories, connect them to broader themes, and demonstrate why archives matter, not just as repositories of the past, but as resources that can shape the future. And many of the business archivists know Erin for her impactful work at Reebok, where she played a key role in establishing and developing the global archive. And through that work, she demonstrated how heritage can inform design, strengthen brand identity, inspire innovation, and create authentic connections with audiences. Today, Erin serves as Senior Director of Business Insights and Performance at History Factory, where she helps organizations transform their histories into strategic assets. Her career spans archives, museums, education, heritage strategy, and brand storytelling, always with a focus on making history relevant and actionable. And what I admired most about Erin is her ability to bridge the worlds of history and strategy, which is so crucial, showing that understanding where we come from can be one of the most powerful tools for deciding where we go next. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Erin. And over to you, Erin. We are eager to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I would like to be able to share my screen for the presentation, just seeing that it's not allowing me to do that. Wait,
We'll do
you're
this
on.
in a minute, yeah.
Okay. As we wait to begin, I really appreciate and really am grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. And I hope that the presentation is really filled with information and knowledge that you can apply and reflect and think about. I think I always say technology is a promise, not a guarantee. All right, here we go.
Try now, Erin. I've
Yep.
made you a presenter.
Right. So as we mentioned earlier, really today's conversation, we're going to talk about activating institutional memory for innovation, trust, and growth. Something we'll sit with today is this idea about what changes when we treat the archive as a generative resource. So less of a vault that we protect and more of something we can utilize and learn. Today we'll be covering kind of 6 movements. I don't think you need to command these to your memory, but we're going to talk about some framing question, overall what the legacy concept I have before you, what it means, how we apply a methodology to this type of work, what it looks like in practice, kind of wrapping up with the archives as a strategic asset, and this really important meaning making and intellectual rigor conversation. So you heard a bit about me, but let's go ahead and talk about kind of who I am and where I speak from. It's true, I have over 2 decades of experience. I have over a decade working in museums, from education all the way up to leadership. And then over the last decade plus, I've been working in corporate spaces. So a little less about my resume. I think today it's really more about what I've learned along the way that I've found to be so useful. So I think it's important we kind of call out that there's no one frame that will fit all of the contexts that we all have as professionals. So thinking about who's in the room for today's conversation, we might have solo archivists who are at family firms with modest budget, maybe no successors, all the way up to regulated industries, right, where custodial rigor for a collection is really imperative and important. It's also important to identify the international aspect of our conversation today, that we're representing diverse markets where the conversation around archives might be mature or emerging. And then I also want to call out our colleagues in the room. So thank you, enterprise users and organizational stakeholders. I think it's very important to represent the diverse audience we have today. So, something that I found to be a very instructive mistake of my own is I made the assumption that if the records in the archive were rigorous, that the strategic value of an archive would be self-evident. And in reality, it's not, right? The work of an archives is not only in the records, it's in the translation, the timing, and being in the room where decisions are being made, or having those relationships to influence decisions or have the visibility to them. So that's something we'll talk about today, as well as kind of what changes when we treat archives as a generative resource. And when I say generative resource, I mean a strategic asset that really generates value for an organization. And I want us to sit with this question. And it's important that we don't divorce it or abandon the idea of custodial rigor, because that's really important to the work we do within corporate archives. So let's take that with us as we move forward. So we're going to discuss kind of a working definition of future legacy. It's important to note that almost no other function spans in both directions like an archive does, right? This horizontal perspective way into the past, into the present, and sometimes into the future. Really, an archivist can sit at that hinge point in the middle of what was and what is becoming. So we all know that the term legacy really refers to what we've inherited, right? What the past has left us. Future legacy, kind of in my mind, is what we're building towards, what the future will inherit. And this might be happening every quarter of a financial year. It could be happening over the period of one year, but really the decisions we're making today will impact what the future will have. So I like to think of living legacy as kind of hugging both sides of what was, right? The activation of the past, the information of this future and present, and the idea of what the future can be. And what's really important to kind of frame this up is, that it's where memory and imagination can really come together to help organizations inform, drive innovation, build community internally and externally, along with belonging, like reinforce trust, and deliver business and cultural value while reinforcing the growth ahead of us. So coming back to that comment I made earlier, that decisions today, so the archives of the future are really being created by the decisions we make today. So here we have a deep responsibility, and sometimes we feel the power of that inconsistently, but it's a really important concept to think about. So this idea of future legacy, the concept of what legacy is, and that living legacy, what we can inhabit at one time. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about a proposed methodology kind of to deal with this idea of living legacy. It's a version of which I learned at History Factory, and it really scales to a variety of partnerships. It's the concept called start with the future and work back, right? So here we're looking at where an organization is going. So many times, not all times, but many times we might think of an archive as what stories can we tell from what we have from the records? And that's great. It really does. It produces content, it produces stories. But I think it's a little different when we think about where is the organization going? Where have we heard strategies aligning to? What does the future look like, or what are we saying the future will look like? And then work back from those stated goals, that stated strategy, and think about what evidence does the archive have to substantiate that position, complicate that position, or contradict it. that kind of shift from, starting from the archive and producing content, or starting from the future and providing evidence, really creates an inversion that changes a lot. Because while content is valuable, evidence is really seen as being strategic, and it helps to position the archive kind of as a strategic advisor. And I will just say that we have plenty of time at the end of today's conversation to take questions. So if you have them, you can jot them down, and we'll come back to them at the end of today's conversation. So what does that mean when we start with the future and work back? Well, it's not necessarily a finding aid that we create. It is more of a brief. It is a short evidence-based document, maybe, that helps, speak honestly about what's known in the archive. What do we have to substantiate, right? What do we have that complicates, and what do we have that might contradict? And it really speaks the language of leadership and of the organization. And I think that's really important. So maybe what you do is sit down and think of 3 to 5 strategic priorities, and where does the record and what's known in the archive really support with evidence? Now, thinking of that action of creating these briefs, creating this kind of evidence from the archive, this really helps to build kind of internal culture and belonging. I would say a heritage, if we think about the holdings of an archive and what we know to be, is most powerful when it's really shared. So, earlier we talked about the democratization of what's known in the archive, but that shared evolved narrative and not a top-down record. Now, it's not to say that when we can engage leaders in amplifying the message and lending their voices to heritage, that it really gains reach and resonance across an entire organization. And using that start with the future and work back really opens up the conversation to be had around heritage and what we know, what we have that substantiates, what we have that complicates, or what we might have that contradicts. So how do we put this in action across any of the size or archives that we mentioned kind of earlier? So if you're a solo archivist, maybe with no budget or no team, maybe you take on one priority, one strategic priority of the organization, a stated future, and create 3 to 5 pieces of evidence. Make that in a one-page brief. At a mid-sized function, maybe there are 2 or 3 colleagues. You work with maybe 3 to 4 internal partners, different functions within the organization, understand where they're going, and provide them with evidence to help them along their journey. And that, ultimate, highly resourced team, this kind of function can be really embedded into the behavior of an organization. This can include strategy offsites, standing executive briefs, maybe quarterly briefs where you're letting the most senior individuals in an organization know how the archive can support strategy. But something that's really important is really being there at the pace of business. And we'll see this come up again, but really it's important to think about how do we move at the speed of business? And we'll get to that in a moment. All right, so let's see this methodology in the wild. I think that there's, Varunda mentioned it earlier, kind of talking about my own lived experience and the work I did at Reebok, I think, as being a really great example of that, but we do have some other examples to walk through. So when I joined Reebok, really, there was boxes and a list of questions, right? There was a physical inventory that was gathered with care, but without strategy. And something that we really did as an archival team, and myself as the leader of that team, was to try to create the conditions in which the archive could operate in this more strategic way. And that included, first and foremost, the creation of a communication strategy where I, as the head of the archive, was going throughout the organization, doing a listening tour and an education tour, meeting with the heads of different business units to understand their point of view on what is an archive to them, what would success look like, as well as educating them on what an archive could be. We were doing this kind of communication strategy work, really setting up the groundwork for a successful integrated archive alongside of all of the custodial rigor that's so important to be a reliable resource for colleagues. So it's not one or the other, it is both. So really that unglamorous work that makes everything else possible is continuously needed. So the path, right, from custodial rigor to being present in the room when decisions are made kind of follows, I would say, these steps. And we'll go back to them in a moment. But one, kind of overarching everything is that understanding that communication strategy deployed throughout the process is key. Remember what I said earlier on in the talk, like if the instructive mistake I made about if the record is rigorous, then the strategic value will be seen wasn't true. So what we had to do is ensure that we had a strong foundation to build off of, right? So everything that we had in, boxes, catalogs, oral memory. And then how do we translate that into reliability that receives repeatable business? So thinking of that briefing kind of situation, one question, one strategic priority became multi-seasons, and because we're in the product world, multi-seasonal program. Right here, it's research, development, access, and use. We want to build a foundation. We want our colleagues to utilize that foundation. And then something else to consider is the relationship archives have with legal, right? So there's a lot of collaboration, I would say, in my experience with the legal departments, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And then I think something that is just really important is know that not every business decision will receive consultation from an archive, and that is okay, right? Not all decisions require the archive. Not all decisions will consult the archive. What the archive and archivist can do is really be the strategic advisor. So after a decision is made, someone can come back and ask clarifying questions, or you can help guide the organization in the future should they need it. But really keeping that door open, but also mindful about when that consultation might not happen. So custodial rigor, though very, very important, is not a stage from which we as archivists graduate from. It's that substrate. It's the thing that makes every other strategic application possible. And it's really important to think of that continuously in a corporate archive. So while the principles that we've presented about building this relationship will travel, and I've often seen it be a kind of a universal sequence, tactics might change, right? Maybe the brief is not the device that you use at your organization. Maybe it's a stand-up, maybe it's an email, maybe it's a different communication channel. But step one will always be that custodial rigor, like building the knowledge that we need to have, the evidence from the archive. Step two is demonstrating value, reliability of that archival holding. And you want to have that repeat business. You want to have multiple stakeholders coming to you across the organization. And I really believe that allows you to be in the room when decisions are made. When you build that track record within an organization, there's the chance to be called upon for strategic counsel. So we talked about demonstrating value, and this one I think is really important. It isn't singular. It's not a one and done, but really you have to show up consistently. The archive's job is always in constant motion. That means showing up consistently, reflecting your organization's language. We don't want to alienate. We really want to be inclusive in the way we talk about archives, history, memory, and really move at the speed of business. Now, I would say this is challenging, and we'll get into it when I have some questions for us to consider about the future. But how do we show up consistently, reflect the language of our organization, and move at the speed of business? All right. So archives as a strategic enterprise asset. We've touched on these topics a little bit before, but there are really two categories that I think are very important that we kind of dive a little deeper in. One of them being intellectual property, and the other being organizational resilience. So intellectual property, this includes trademark defense, claim substantiation, licensing evaluation. Thinking back to what I talked about, having great relationships with legal, archives can do this in a way that maybe the legal department might not have all of the receipts over time for when something was introduced into the market. So the archives can offer this as a really valuable insight to our colleagues in legal. And then the other column I have is this idea of organizational resilience. So most leaders across organizations carry about 5 years of memory with them. But what's really interesting is if you think about the archive, it offers longitudinal view, right, spanning decades. So it can provide insight into what happened during the last recession, the last regulatory shift, or the shift before that. And this pattern recognition across decades is really valuable. Now, it's important to kind of note that longitudinal data is not self-explanatory. The work of interpreting the pattern is really part of the value an archivist provides. Archivists not only provide records, they also help to provide meaning. The interpretation, the knowledge of an organization over time is very important. And it's something that the archives can do in a unique and different way. So if we think about meaning making and intellectual rigor, like archiving is an active intellectual discipline, right? Every accession, every finding aid, every deaccession choice is an interpretive act. It is not just this passive custodial function. So I like to think about what this being a very useful frame for me as we think about meaning making and intellectual rigor. We have what's known, that tacit knowledge that's held within people that can walk out the door when a veteran employee retires. What's documented, the holdings, it's a durable record. It's always partial, right? It's never complete. And then what's missing, absent, or signaled. So this is the negative space. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's deliberate, but naming it is intellectual honesty, and it's really important we do it. This idea about what's known, what's documented, and what's missing, that conversation around evidence that we talked about earlier will just continue to be important. Evidence and the expectation of having it will only deepen. It won't weaken, right? Knowing that trust is the word the rest of the organization uses. Authenticity could be the word marketing uses. In reality, now I think sometimes it's almost assumed that stakeholders, increasingly expect narratives that reflect who built an organization and who has been affected by it. And we know from the holdings of an archive that might not be 100% documented. So how do we put those three categories, known, documented, and missing, to use to build trust, right? To do all that we think future legacy can provide us. So known, that tacit knowledge. I think this is the time, and I heard earlier during the kickoff, to record it, thinking about oral histories, informational interviews, and knowledge sharing conversations among employees and other stakeholders. The documented, the holdings, the action here is use it, right? Create access, that access and use, that shared heritage we mentioned earlier is super important to keep the archive moving. And then the missing, the absent, and the signaled, this is an opportunity to use the community to fill in the gaps and be transparent about what is known and what is not known. Really, so thinking about known, documented, and missing, and how really it's an inclusive circle. You can utilize one another to each of these different areas to really help inform and grow the others. So I wanted to give a few examples of this. So we brought this to life at Reebok, for instance. Something that was missing from the collection, though signaled, was the work of a designer named E. Scott Morris. And he was a really important designer during the 1990s at Reebok, did an incredible job of designing important performance footwear. And that while it was missing, I had a community of people at Reebok that could get E. Scott's ear. They could reach out to him. And I had a very interesting phone call with him one day. He was preparing to leave the United States and move to China to work for Anta. And he said, you know what? I feel comfortable. I will send you my personal archive from Reebok. And he did that. And that's what you see in the first picture. But that kind of unboxing experience, we didn't want to happen kind of in a vacuum. We made this a community event that specific designers who were really interested in this time period, or they were moving in the strategy area to develop more around performance, they came in, they could get their hands on the history and kind of understand who he was as an individual and a contributor to the brand. In addition to that, we extended an invitation to E. Scott to come to headquarters and have his oral history documented. And that's what you see in the middle. Here he is, we're getting prepared with a setup of different images, and he could sit and provide us all of that tacit knowledge around that time. And the other thing we did in the final image on the right-hand side is he held these sessions in which designers, product marketers came together, and he could really deep dive, answer any questions, and have the ability to share that knowledge, share the evidence he provided, but the knowledge that surrounded that time at Reebok, and really transfer that to the next generation of leaders. Now, I have some other case studies to share with you. This one in particular, we did this work at History Factory. This is with National Grid. National Grid is an energy transmission organization, headquartered in the UK, but also has representation in the northeast of the United States. And for them, it was gaining some understanding of tacit knowledge. They, had acquired many companies over time. And what they wanted to do was understand what it meant to be National Grid. So we conducted over 30 oral histories across a variety of roles within the organization. So geographies covered 10 years experience. We had a 30-year lineman veteran that works right on the transmission lines, all the way up to the outgoing CEO and former chairman, who's pictured right here in the bottom middle. People working in control rooms, but really understanding, a more human experience at National Grid. Another example, when we think of stakeholder engagement, both internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, we worked with Boston Beer Company. So they're based in Boston, and they're most known for one of their brands called Samuel Adams. And we were helping them celebrate Samuel Adams' anniversary. And we did this pop-up exhibition at one of the breweries. And yes, we're seeing a beautiful display here, but two other things that we did during this event is we invited drinkers to share their stories and bring artifacts that they would have liked to donate to the archive. And really that showed the commitment Boston Beer Company has to creating an inclusive narrative that reflects the impact it's made on individuals and drinkers as well. And then finally, I wanted to share another example of reinforcing culture and that idea of future legacy with the Caterpillar. We worked with them to do a global, or world road show or global world tour, where we had 4 of these trailers traveling, and they went to over 25 countries, making over 140 stops, and engaging with over 100,000 guests, which were primarily internal, employees of Caterpillar, and sharing with them the kind of where they've been, but also the next 100 years, this idea of where we could go together. And I think it was a really important way to show the strategic value of the archive and supporting kind of their aspirations for the future, as well as helping to educate and be inclusive in the stories brought forth in this experience. And then finally, just getting kind of a breadth of the organizations who we've worked with at History Factory. So some of our clients who really value their archives and histories as this generative resource. You can see a few of them here. So the future of future legacy, and we're rounding third base and heading home here with some questions to consider. So some questions I have for us to consider is like, what's the role of technology in the future of archival work, right? I think that's a very interesting topic for us to explore and think about, especially the advent of AI. How will speed impact the role of archival work in the future? I mentioned this at the speed of business. If that's always changing, how do we kind of remain, present at the speed of business? And then finally, like, how will knowledge management, right, this function within an organization and the archival functions coexist in the future, right? If we think about the what's known, what's documented, and what's missing, what exists there when we consider the knowledge management function and archival functions together. So I know, in closing, my invitation isn't to be more rigorous with our collections, though I know it's inherent to those who work in corporate archives, but it is really to be more generative, to treat archives not as a vault we defend, but as a resource that can help inform decisions, right? Build trust, reinforce growth without surrendering what's so important about custodial rigor. So from me, it's start with the future and then return to your collection and ask, what is this evidence for? And who has to see its value before the future arrives? So I do want to just invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can right there, and that's the logo for History Factory. And
Erin, there is a question from Professor Louisa Rodriguez that says, of course, she thanks you for your wonderful presentation. And she says, how do you use archival material as data to improve the company's operations?
Okay, so the question is, how do you use the archive as
data, archival material as data to improve companies' operations? Yeah.
So I think there's a variety of ways you can do that. Sometimes it's having insight into where the organization is going. Are they looking to let's say, enter a specific market, and they want to understand, one, do we have a history in that market? If so, what is the history? Any lessons we can learn? So then kind of taking that question, you can go into the archive and do the necessary research to say, oh, this isn't the first time we've worked in this space or this industry. In fact, we did it at this time. This is why we did it, if we have that insight, or this is what we can infer, or this is, what we know and what we don't know. So sometimes it's equipping individuals with then more knowledge around that time that they can apply to the operations of an organization. I think that's probably a very general way of answering that. But hopefully that's helpful. What are ways to showcase stories from the past, from the archives to the future, or for current generations? I think there are a variety of ways that you can deploy channels to engage, a then now, how it started, how it's going. You can use any kind of internal platforms. Physical archives are very helpful, along with thinking about, if a different part of the organization is having an offsite, maybe, is there an opportunity to have a special invitation to the archive to come and talk about a topic for 10, 15 minutes and get them thinking critically about, maybe it's disruptive technology, right? That seems to be like a topic we're all dealing with now. But can you give us some history how an organization has worked with disruptive technology in the past? Like the advent of the internet, what did we do? What were some key learnings? How do we apply it to automation? How do we apply that to operations? And show, in some cases, it provides employees with evidence that we've gotten through difficult times before, we will again, or that it can be like carte blanche to how you can problem solve today. Okay, I'm looking at some other questions.
There's another question by Samiksha here. She says, what are some of the ways that archivists identify the language of the organization? What we are not supposed to miss, what are we supposed to look out for?
It's listening. It's so, yeah, that's, thinking about being present during, town halls, listening to your leaders speak, understanding, looking at annual reports and listening to your colleagues. And really, it's about then reflecting their language. You want to hear what they're saying. You want to identify those key terms. So if your leadership refers to employees as coworkers, use coworkers. If you're saying we have a strategic ambition, say ambition. We know our ambition is X. Is it pillars? We all are very susceptible to picking up on business language, but it's so important that we reflect it. And it just, in my mind, it removes a barrier to entry for the value of archives, is when you can really reflect the language of an organization.
That's quite lovely response. Lakshmi notes that both historians as users of the archive. Lakshmi has said that they're invested in the past, and with corporates themselves using the notion of evidence rather than content. They were emphasizing on that. So, is there a particular, perhaps a reason you would like to, I guess, know more about that?
Yeah, I think so. Content is something that is, in my mind, so we can say content makes its way into the archive. An archive can produce content. Usually we think of that production of content to be storytelling or something that will be consumed. It has a shelf life. But when I think of evidence, and while that evidence can change, to me it's more evergreen. if I'm talking about, I want the evidence of innovation over time, then I can look and find evidence of innovation. And that evidence of innovation should stand up this quarter, it should stand up next quarter. And it really kind of positions the archive, I think, into being always relevant. Whereas content production could be timely and temporal. It's just for a small period of time. Yeah. And evidence, I mean, yeah, I could go on for a while, but
Oh, well, we have a far more potent question here, and I'm sure this is something that all organizations and archives face around the world. There's Arun and Kasha both asking about how do smaller businesses, new tech companies, those who have, uh, you know, slightly greater limits on their resources, how do you then justify the costs involved in building archives? How do you exactly revolve around that very practical reality and go ahead then?
well, I think a frame that you can apply is so regardless of an age of an organization, there's always evidence being you're producing items that are worthy of an archive. And I think it's thinking about what is known and not documented. So think of that tacit knowledge. What do you have documented and collated? And then what is missing? And if you think of it kind of in a more agile point of view, I think you can do a good job in slowly growing it. But I think what's interesting is in my experience, it doesn't matter the size or age of an organization. There are already people within it who are they are creating their own, like their own archives, right? Even in maybe it's in your SharePoint, maybe it's in your email archive. But what happens when you can consolidate that across an organization? Is it then part of your quarterly, leadership meetings? We're going to take a moment and we're going to kind of go through a list of questions so we have an understanding of what's happened in the last quarter. But I would say the barrier to entry, let's keep it as low as possible and think about what can be done internally to build that evidence and that knowledge for the archives of the future, that future legacy.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to remember it in reality, especially if you're at a startup, a technology startup, right? We think of like digital redundancy and the kind of what is the evidence? Why did we make this decision? Why did we go with X funder and not Y funder? And so you're really at it. It's an exciting place to be where you can help determine like what should we keep? Why should we keep it? What do we want to know from this in the future? What value will it have for us?
Well, we have a few more questions. I'm hoping you do have the time, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a question which asks about what else apart from documents that archives and organizations can record. I mean, this is of course one of those important things that archives, of course, put through. But I think it will be best to know from somebody like you who's from History Factory and caters to so many different organizations.
Sure. So I think there are a variety of material types that you would want to acquire. And I think it's so interesting that we refer to it as documents. And of course it is documents, but in reality, over the last 25, 35 years, most of the content we're producing is digital, right? So thinking about the digital footprint of an organization, you want to think of how different communication channels and devices. So is it in newsletters to employees? Is it, the business resource groups? Is it evidence of prototyping? Or investment in different partnerships? So that can be, a lot of that content could be recordings, it could be transcripts, it could be video, it could be digital in the sense that maybe it's capturing a website that existed. We think of the value that the Internet Archive provides us all of the time for understanding what something looked like in, your first website in 1998 or 96, right? And also the voices that you're choosing to capture. So are you looking, we talked about the top down is probably the easiest way to capture content for an organization, the directives of leadership, those, you know, town halls, quarterly, like investor relation reports, any of those type of reports. But think of, do we want to understand onboarding experience over time, or recent graduates experience, or, the development of different departments, and kind of think that way as well. So I think there's a variety of material types you can produce from a variety of areas within the organization.
There is an archivist question, strictly archivist. Well, there is one which says, what is the biggest mistake archivists make when they build an archive program, and how one can avoid it?
Wow. Let me get a crystal ball. So for me, I think I don't want to go back to what I presented on, but the instructive mistake was, if I do my job really well within an archive and build the archive's, record, then everyone will see the value it has. And to me, that just was not the case. The way in which you make the archives relevant is, I firmly believe it's the listening and educating. It's the creating a network, and you create people who can come to you. So I think while it is part of the practice to heads down and really work on the collection itself, remember to keep your head up, to listen, to hear signals across an organization, and to make yourself known, and to add value where you can. I think that tension, everyone will have a backlog, right? There will always be materials to accession over time. But if there's no access and use to that collection, then what is its value?
In fact, speaking of accession, there is another question which says, um, what and who, like how and who decides what to archive, especially when you have, say a 20-year-old history, a stream of events spanning 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or whatever. So how do you decide, and who decides what to stay? Of course, I think as archivists, we sort of know, but it will be lovely to, sort of hear from you.
Yeah. So in my experience, I have seen the most successful archives be built through creating kind of a cross-functional committee that helps make those decisions, right? Because it's impossible for an archives function to know everything, right? You can't know everything. Even when I said like listen and educate, I understand that that's also, build a network of people that you can rely upon as well. So I think having a cross-functional set of stakeholders that represent, the areas of the business, from if it's in product, from product creation, creative direction, strategy, marketing, like wholesale partner, like sales relationships, wherever it might be, whatever those distinctions within an organization might be, and then having the right representation. But generally what happens, right, as at an organization, is you set up a collecting policy that takes into consideration what you want to preserve and why, and the use, and like what do we need to look at. But in my mind, right, everyone has a bias, right? If it's intentional or not. It's just you need to have more eyes and more voices. And I think that also helps an archive really be embedded into something that's less likely to go away. So you have then the structure and the support.
All right, I guess we have just one last question remaining, and I've kept it deliberately. Okay, there's one more, but okay, just a second. Okay, there's one that says, how far are the versions or too many draft copies of a final archival book or publications important? Like, this is somebody from the publishing industry, I'm sure. Thank you, Anshu, for that question. But I'm guessing over to you, Erin, if you'd like to answer this. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a complicated one, right? I think
The
it's
copy of copy, you know?
yeah, but it's like, does the copy have correspondence? Does the copy provide insight as to why a final version was approved or not? And I think there's a lot to be said. Like now we think of correspondence today as happening through Teams or through, email, maybe Slack. But correspondence years ago, right, was through letters, and those are a little easier to detect. So sometimes we need the breadcrumbs. We need to understand like the decisions that were made. So any evidence of that decision. But I know, like, as I say that, my colleagues within the archival, space at History Factory would have, I mean, I think there are a lot of opinions on this, I
Yeah.
guess I would say.
All right. I guess we're moving to our very last question. And I kept it deliberately, as I was saying, towards the end, because it says it today, of course, because we've spoken so much about archiving and, strategic leveraging of history. Of course, one cannot deny the very, very evident question of AI. And what is your take on it in the present times, how it impacts um archives and this entire business of business history, you know?
Yeah. Well, personally, I think that the use of AI within an organization and positioning the archivist in the loop. So sometimes we hear the term human in the loop as a way to have somebody making the decisions on what it is part of the knowledge base, and then the judgment after AI returns, the LLM returns a response to help provide some value to the judgment of what is shared. I think for us, it is an incredible opportunity to think about access and use of the archive within an organization in a very different way. I don't ever foresee the role of an archivist going away. And, I talked about the interpretation, this longitudinal data. Like AI is really great at helping us provide patterns and insights and maybe looking at evidence differently. But I really feel strongly about the idea that an archivist's role will be that of conductor and helping our colleagues have a closeness to the evidence that it's providing. There is, so at History Factory, we do have a solution, but we've created a solution in a way that's very mindful about reinforcing institutional knowledge. So we really want to set it up within the parameters that keep security in mind, the lack of hallucinations in mind, really grounding. So grounding responses in citable evidence that we can find within archival documents. That is all so critical, especially when we talk about things like trust. And we understand kind of the repercussions of 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 that, essentially. Hopefully that answers.